A typical winter in Arkansas can only be described as both peaceful yet frigid. In comparison to their regular humid summers, Arkansas has been known to play host to bitter winter winds and fluctuating freezing temperatures that are often unpredictable. Though despite this, there is beauty that comes with the dead season. While the ancient trees stand bare of their leaves, it allows for the crimson cardinals to easily be spotted. When the harsh, cruel winds search for skin to bite, they also bring along a dusting of snow that blankets the landscape in a crystallized stasis. As night arrives earlier than usual, it plunges the world into a cold darkness. But it also unleashes visions of the heavens above us, twinkling starlight suspended far from reach. Truly, winter does have its moments. This peaceful setting, however, while beautiful, can often lead some down a darkened path. The early nights and freezing weather can deteriorate one's mind if not careful, resulting in radical steps that may lead to some undesired consequences. Members who made up the small community of Gurdon in 1931 know this reality all too well. It was here, just outside of town, would tempers overflow and drastic actions become the prevailing path taken. What happened one winter night outside of Gurdon would forever leave behind an otherworldly stain that would develop the habit of returning night after night. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and welcome back to another episode on the Moonlight Lore podcast. If one were to travel roughly 85 miles south of Little Rock, following along Interstate 30, eventually you would come to Gurdon, a small town of around 2,000 people nestled neatly in central Clark County. Farmers dominate the surrounding area, their sea of vibrant fields dancing along the breeze's tune, producing a hue of colors that draw the creative eye. And while the picturesque beauty of the region provides comfort and stability for the residents who call Gurdon their home, there's a graphic legend that lays in wait, revealing itself ever so often as to both draw in suspicion as well as wonder. Some locals recognize it as the Glow, but it's more widely known as the Gurdon Light, a mystifying ball of brilliant shimmering light that some say is the spirit of a man whose life was abruptly cut short. Those who live in and around the isolated community fondly remember a time when they had seen the tantalizing glow of the floating orb. It's become something similar to that of a rite of passage for young teenagers looking for a thrill or to frighten one another. Out past the edges of town, one only but needs to journey along the old rusted tracks of the Missouri Pacific Railroad. If you're lucky, on calm, tranquil nights, the light of Gurdon is said to appear, gently drifting past the black branches and dancing its way along the track towards those who risked the opportunity to witness the fading orb. For the past 92 years, the orb has been a local legend that has since spurred international interest due to the violent and graphic nature that revolves around the emergence of the light. Horrifically, the folklore behind this paranormal resurgence may reign true as history reveals itself and confirms the violent end for a man who became a victim of circumstances out of his control. It's here, on the outskirts of this inconsequential town, would this brutal legend unfold, and the cursed light of Gurdon be doomed to wander for all eternity. The roaring 20s were over, the dirty 30s had begun, and this spelt misery for millions of hard-working blue-collar workers across the world. The backcountry of Arkansas, as remote and sparse as it was no exception to the misfortune that plagued America. Those in Gurdon struggled. There was no loophole anyone could exploit to discover new prospects or keep their fleeting careers. Lewis McBride was one such man who found he had been thrust into a world with a collapsing economy. As a longtime resident of Gurdon, Lewis was fortunate enough to have found what he had believed was steady employment with the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company. As a member of the rail crew, he was subjected to a harsh environment that demanded strenuous, exhausting labor, resulting in him leaving at the end of each day with an unrelenting number of sore muscles. He was an honest worker and realized how blessed he was to have found steady employment during a time of such strife. But nothing lasts forever. It was William McLean, section foreman for the railroad, who would ultimately decide how history would play out. It was the early December season, which meant work had slowed considerably over the past few months, leading to some difficult confrontations. The company, like so many others, had been hit hard due to the faltering economy. Layoffs were imminent, and those few who were selected to stay on received shortened shifts, resulting in less pay. Naturally, those who remained employed were silently growing tired of the substantial lack of income, though they remained tight-lipped out of fear of losing their jobs. Those who were completely let go were forced to face destitution with the rest of America. Thus far, Lewis had managed to remain in his employer's good graces and hold on to his job a little while longer, though talk around the shop told him otherwise. A few loose-lipped co-workers whispered that he may be next in line on the chopping block. With already mounting concerns about the future growing larger by the day, Lewis was without a doubt feeling the wrathful stress that would accompany anyone in his position. He had a proper rapport with his boss, William. The man was tough but fair. He expected his men to pull their weight. If they didn't, there was a line of others who were more than eager to take their place. Lewis had found as so long as he kept his head down, finished his work, he had no issues with the man. He respected those who completed their tasks on time and rewarded the few who took initiative. Lewis had no reason to expect that the man would suddenly lay him off without good reason. Still though, he couldn't help but consume the rumors that were surfacing more and more each day. It was good to be aware, to be cautious, but there's only so much a man can take before overthinking and pressure pushes them past the point of no return. Lewis knew his life was going exceptionally well in comparison to many others, but he also remembered that age-old idiom, all good things must come to an end. It was a proverb that rang truer and truer as the weeks passed on. Gurdon was suffering. The farmers' fields produced a pitiful amount of crops, not nearly enough to make an income, only enough to feed their families. And even so, many plates were still served half-empty during that time. The local businesses, unable to find paying customers, sustained heavy suffering as well. With a limited cash flow, Gurdon was set to become a ghost town. Only by pure luck would it endure. Of course, though, nobody at the time could possibly realize how bad things would get. They could only recognize the way things had been going in their present day. It was enough to raise concern, but in those early years, hope still lingered. Folks fully believed that soon, things would return to normal. Everyone would be able to find work, farms would be able to produce food, and businesses would once again thrive. When none of that happened, people grew desperate. People began to panic. This was still a far cry from that December season in 1931, however. Years of misfortune were ahead of them, but nobody knew that. Lewis McBride was only thinking about his job. He needed to make ends meet, and after seeing the pattern of layoffs, the troubles of others were far from his mind. He didn't have time to think about the failing farms, nor those who waited outside factories hoping to win the employment lottery. He needed to ensure his job was safe, and to do that, he needed to have a conversation with William McLean. When Lewis entered William's office, he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Best case scenario was William would be able to dispel the rumors circulating throughout the rail yard that he was in danger of losing his job. Worst case was that this meeting would somehow trigger the end of his career. Either result would give him an answer, but was it worth the risk? Would it dissolve the worry and stress that lingered in his mind, or would it inflate those emotions tenfold? William initially was not so receptive to this intrusion at the end of the day. He had already begun his end-of-shift routine, and dealing with strenuous work in sub-zero temperatures all day didn't leave much room for a sympathetic mood on his part. Of course, he heard out Lewis's concerns, that he was growing more anxious by the day due to the talk that was spreading around the yard. With an exasperated sigh, William confirmed those rumors. Lewis was next in line to lose his job. He was a good worker, but just lacked the skills that the other guys had. Lewis disagreed. He already knew that he was great at his job. He didn't need to hear that. But to be told that he lacked the skills to complete his work was nearly insulting to him. He'd easily complete his work day in and day out, so he didn't quite understand why the man thought he should be let go. Lewis had faced his fair share of iniquity in the past. As an African American, he was all too familiar with the systemic racism that plagued much of America. So naturally, he assumed the comment William made about his lack of skills was merely a ruse to hide the real reason he was being let go. Infuriated, Lewis raised his voice, accusing his employer of playing favorites and attempting to be rid of one of the few good men he had on the crew, all because of his skin color. William, now standing up from his desk to meet the enraged man, argued back at Lewis that he had been slacking. He was good at his job, but it wasn't enough to save him from the layoffs. The others just had talent and skills he didn't have, and that was that. There were no hidden motives. Lewis, now allowing his temper to get the better of him, flung insults at the man who stood tall with a false sense of security. William was no better than he thought, and to pretend that he was damn near comical. Lewis stood from his chair, outraged by the man's cavalier attitude in this weighted decision. Lewis made it clear that he would not stand for this injustice. He stormed out of William's office, all while a dark cloud hung over him. William collapsed back into his chair, an ominous premonition flooding his gut. The twilight hour had arrived. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into a bewitching orange hue. The frost that had started to accumulate sent shivers down William's spine as he stepped out from his warm wooden shack. A cloud of condensation engulfed his face as he let out a long, tired breath. Sending someone home permanently was not something he was fond of doing, despite what some may think. He knew what happens to those who lose their job in this economy. It wasn't pleasant. He didn't wish that for any of his men, but those above him seemed to see things differently. They weren't on the ground floor. They weren't there to see how difficult and tiring the work was, the camaraderie that came with it. All they saw were numbers, and if those numbers told them people needed to be let go, they didn't hesitate to make the call. The frigid metal in his hand bit down on his fingertips as he closed both the lock to his office and the thoughts from his mind. Dwelling too hard on the subject was bad for one's mental health. His arms were tied, and there was no changing the decision. Lewis would just have to cope with the loss, he thought. As he slowly made his way to his vehicle to begin the short drive back into Gurdon, he pulled his key from his pocket and placed it into the door. At the moment of their turn, a snap of a twig reached his ears, drawing his attention to the figure standing behind him. All good things must come to an end. This couldn't have rang truer on that cold December evening of 1931. That night, the actions committed would not only alter the course for many lives in Gurdon, but also birth a legend that persists at this very day. As the warm glow of the sun breached the glass panes into William McLean's bedroom, his wife stirred for a moment, reaching out to touch the body of her husband. Barely awake, it almost didn't register when her hand fell upon the empty, cold sheets that her husband wasn't lying there next to her. With a pair of drowsy eyes, she then peered across their little bedroom, wondering if he had already gotten up and was getting ready for work. A quick gaze at the alarm clock revealed it wasn't even 6 in the morning yet, which was strange. William rarely woke up before 7 and was habitually out the door at 8. For him to be up and at it at this hour was completely against his character. The clothes she had laid out on the chair were left untouched. The front door was left unlocked. The entire house fell silent as the realization sunk in. William hadn't come home from work last night. A half hour later, and a phone began to ring. Across town, the town marshal received a frantic call from a distraught Mrs. McLean. She reported that her husband had not yet returned home from the previous night's shift and had received no indication on where he was or why there was such a delay. She had tried to call his office but wasn't able to get through to anyone. She hoped the marshal would investigate. The marshal, whose name had been omitted from the local legend, presumed that this was not a pressing issue. William had likely only been held back to work an extra shift to fill in for another man. Nevertheless, he agreed and assured Mrs. McLean that he would drive out to the rail yard to see if anyone knew of his whereabouts. Another half hour later and the marshal had arrived. By this point, it was a little past 7 in the morning and he quickly discovered the entire yard was deserted. Not a single soul in sight. Approaching the small shop and office, the officer cupped his hands around his mouth and cried out for William. The eerie silence that followed after the echo of his voice did little to assure him that his hypothesis was correct. The man had obviously not stayed for an extra shift and production had yet to start for the day. Now there was certainly cause for concern. Heading back into town, the marshal began questioning those he found on the street. At the time, Gurdon was not a large community. The quaint settlement allowed for neighbors to get to know one another. It became quite rare to find an instance when someone didn't know who another person was. And yet, despite the size of the town, nobody had seen William last evening nor early this morning. It was as if the man had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Realizing no one was able to bestow a clue to this sudden investigation, the marshal then returned back to the rail yard, where William's crew would be arriving. There he would question those who returned to work. There he would start to unravel the mystery of his missing man. Since the rest of the crew could clearly see Lewis McBride was nowhere in sight, they informed the questioning officer that he was set to be let go. He was last seen entering William's office last night, and thus likely the last person to see the man. The fact that Lewis had not arrived to work that morning was a dead giveaway that the conversation he had set out to have about the stability of his career had not gone well. This was a huge breakthrough for the marshal. To anyone with this context, there clearly was a confrontation that had unfolded, but now the mystery expanded to 2 missing men. Where were they, and what had truly transpired between the two to prevent either of them from returning to work the next day? The marshal's new mission was to find Lewis. If he was indeed the last person to have spoken with William, he must know something about his whereabouts. Another trip back into town would grant the investigator his desired discovery. Before he had even gotten to the building where Lewis had resided in, he spotted the man shakily walking down the sidewalk, no less suspicious looking than a child who was caught with their hand in the cookie jar. Pulling up beside him, the marshal leaned out his window to gauge the situation and exchange a phony good morning. There was no doubt something troubled the man, and judging by his reaction when the officer questioned him on where he was coming from and if he might know where William McLean could possibly be, there was no clearer indication that Lewis knew more than he was willing to openly share. With no better person of interest that could shed light on the missing person case, the marshal took Lewis in for questioning, and it didn't take long for the whole story to spill out. Furious at the seemingly spontaneous decision to fire him, Lewis left William's office in a fiery rage. He couldn't believe, after all he had done for the man, his crew, and the company, that they would just toss him aside like he was nothing. Blinded by his vexation, Lewis came to the conclusion that revenge was the only way he could be rid of his resentment. He waited around for William to leave his building. He was always the last one to leave at the end of the day, so catching him alone and off guard should make for an easy performance. As he waited just on the edge of the rail yard, camouflaged by the dead brush, he waited in an endless anticipation. His breath was heavy, his hand clasped firmly to the spiked maul he would use to do the deed. He watched his prey emerge from the safety of its bunker. William was now out in the open, an easy target. As he watched him move across the yard towards his truck, blissfully ignorant of the danger that lurked behind him, Lewis took advantage of the man's tired and relaxed disposition. He moved closer to his target, slowly, taking great care as to not reveal his presence or his intentions. When he was only but a mere couple feet away, a twig beneath his boot broke the silence. His soon-to-be victim spun, his eyes wide and breath caught. Lewis's moment had ended before it even began. For a split moment, the two men stared at each other. William with nothing but his truck keys in hand, and Lewis, a weighted maul raised in the air in his. Both gentlemen stood there in silence for what seemed like forever, each daring the other to make the first move. William, knowing he was at a disadvantage, opened his mouth to try and calm the situation he was thrust into. Lewis didn't give him the chance to speak. With a punishing thud, the spiked maul made contact with William's skull, turning his world black. He fell to the ground, silent and unmoving. Lewis stood over him, looking down at the man who had only just before sentenced him to a moment of hardship, but now also signed away his life. There was no going back from this play. He had murdered his ex-boss, a foreman of the Missouri Pacific Railroad Company. There was no way the authorities would let this slide. They would find him and sentence him to an early demise. He had to hide the evidence. He had to ensure no one but him would ever be able to find the body. A quick scan of the yard ensured Lewis that he was still alone. He bent down and grasped the ankles of William McLean and dragged his limp body several yards into the woods and dropped him down into an embankment. He thought to himself that this must be good enough. He couldn't see the rail yard from where he stood, so no one there should be able to spot William's body laying motionless in the dirt. For good measure, Lewis piled snow and debris over the body and laid the bloody maul he had used next to it. With the deed done, he cleaned the dirt from his rugged hands. Once more he gazed over his work, a rush of emotions filling his mind. What he had just done here was unforgivable, but then there was no going back from this. With a weakened sigh, Lewis gathered what courage he had left and turned his back on the corpse he had just created. Without looking back, he fled, darting from the woods with guilt quick on his heels. The woods were silent. Their typical symphony of bird songs and skittering critters lay absent. Sifting through the underbrush and pulling past the dead branches, the marshal drew near the location Lewis had indicated where he had left the body. As he walked among the frosted trees and made his way towards the embankment, the decaying leaves disturbed by his heavy footfalls revealed a rusted implement barely visible amidst its camouflaged environment. A spiked maul, the very weapon Lewis claimed to have used when attacking William. The marshal knew he was on the right track, but any sign of his missing man remained elusive. Something odd did appear to him, though. As he stumbled his way through the dead forest, he realized there were other tracks. Something had been dragged off, not a good sign. Likely a wild animal had been attracted to the scent of fresh death and attempted to steal away the body of the foreman to feast upon in an unscrupulous manner. He followed the trail, taking great care to gently move about the woods so as not to disturb the forest floor, as he previously had. He didn't want to mistakenly upset the trail and have it lead him down the wrong path. As he trudged his way back towards the edge of the forest, there he discovered the cold, lifeless body of William McLean. Incorrectly thought, he didn't perish by the mighty blows of the maul, but merely by the consequences of them. Rather than passing into the beyond in the shallow embankment where he had been so haphazardly dumped, William had managed to regain consciousness, crawling from his makeshift gravesite, attempting to return to the safety of the rail yard. Midnight exposure and immeasurable blood loss ate away at his eroded body. He was nearly out of the woods, but was never able to make it into the clearing. Not that it would have mattered. He likely would not have made it much further if he had gotten to the yard, and less likely to have been able to reach and operate his truck to find help. No amount of divine intervention would have prevented death from plucking its prize. At that point, the case had been solved. Lewis McBride was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by electrocution at the Little Rock Penitentiary on July 8th of 1932. All accounts would assume the story would end there, at the death of the killer. But this is where the story truly develops into something more than just your average murder. Soon after Lewis's soul had been removed from this earth, it became evidently clear that someone else's had decided to stick around. Nearly instantly, reports of a strange flickering light seen traveling up and down the 4-mile stretch of railroad outside of Gurdon began flooding in. Workers were reportedly witnessing a sometimes yellowish white or bluish light that moved as if it was being carried by a disembodied figure. It would sway and move about similar to that of a lantern, a common instrument often used by the early morning or nightly work crews, and hover only a mere few feet off the ground. The brave few who would approach the skittish orb found it would quickly disappear when one drew near, only for it to reappear behind them moments later, as if to avoid coming into contact with the individual investigating. It was peculiar to say the least, a ghostly fire burning on the outskirts of Gurdon. It was the perfect haunting tale for the eager newspapers who were developing the story as it grew by the year. Interested locals who found themselves passing near the tracks late at night or before the morning twilight would occasionally be treated to a stunning sight of a ball of fire wisping its way through the woods, disappearing behind the crowds of shaded trunks. Through the passage of time, the Gurdon Light has become a paranormal phenomenon, one that has tantalized and lured excitable ghost hunters to the site of purgatory. Everyone wishes to see for themselves the last remaining remnant of the slain foreman, a man forever wandering the tracks, searching by the light of a lantern for an escape from his unrest. The deep, pressing atmosphere present at the location where the light of Gurdon is said to roam lends credence to the belief something horrific occurred there at one point. The scenery is dark, oppressive. One must pass through an overgrown stretch of sodden forest, then pass an abandoned, moss-infested cemetery, and arrive in an isolated neighborhood where neither life nor death seem present. When it comes to frightful legends, this location certainly delivers this one justice. Murky variations and bountiful theories that have naturally emerged from contending the historical accuracy of this grisly tale suggest the light that dwells beyond the borders of Gurdon does not actually belong to the murdered spirit of William McLean. Some, intending on twisting the story to allow the theme of vengeance to lay absent, suggest the glow belongs to a poor, unnamed rail worker who had the misfortunate luck of losing his own head when falling upon the rail tracks while a train passed by. It is then said that the light derives from the headless ghost of the worker, who tirelessly is in search of his missing cranium. But most folks are reserved to believe that the light is produced by none other than William. In 1994, a television crew working under the program Unsolved Mysteries aimed to discover the truth behind the legend. By the time they had arrived, they came with the sole question of why this thing exists, rather than if it exists. Over the decades, the light had been well documented and witnessed by hundreds, albeit photographs and videos often produce blurry and unsatisfactory concrete evidence of its existence. Robert Stack, host of Unsolved Mysteries, wished to get to the bottom of this intriguing story. Ultimately, their search for practical answers failed to uncover the source of the light. While the mystery of the Gurdon Light had become statewide knowledge for quite some time at this point, the investigation and broadcast done by Unsolved Mysteries had thrust the legend into international limelight. Skeptics and believers alike arrived in droves to the small town with deep aspirations of witnessing or solving the case of the fabled ghost of Gurdon. None have been successful in providing a satisfactory answer as to why the light appears and acts the way it does. Theories do exist, but lack believability when examined closely. One such theory suggests the light is merely headlights shining off the moistened tree trunks by passing cars traveling down the nearby highway. though sightings of the light date back as far as 1931, far preceding the construction of the nearby highway. The hills and forested land would also prevent any artificial light from breaking through to the isolated tracts where the ghostly glow is said to inhabit. Another theory suggests the light could be swamp gas, also known as the folkloric phenomenon of will-o'-the-wisps. Legends surrounding the will-o'-the-wisp would lead us to believe the lights are created by fairy folk, remnants of the dead, or even elemental spirits. In truth, they are escaped gases, a mixture of phosphine and methane, that have found their way up from the veins of the earth, and once they are met with the presence of air, ignite into a spontaneous bluish-white flame. Certainly a legitimate theory for what could be occurring along those rusted tracks, but a longtime Gurdon resident, Mike Klingon, a graduate from the University of South Carolina for physics, contests that the infamous Gurdon Light is nothing of the sort. He has conducted an abundance of scientific studies and tests on the light, and has yet to conceive of a definite answer as to what might be causing it. He openly discounts the prevailing theory that it could be traffic headlights causing the phenomenon, and the fact that he has witnessed the light hundreds of times in all sorts of weather conditions and it always happens to hold shape suggests to him it cannot be caused by swamp gas. Another prevailing authority on the Gurdon Light before his death was Dr. Charles Lemming, a professor of physics at Henderson State University. He, along with several of his students, had conducted several tests and observations on the light, trying to disprove its phantom origins. He had found throughout all his scrutiny, the light never polarized. It remained consistent regardless of atmospheric conditions, which meant it could not have been a mirage they were witnessing. The last remaining theory that continues to persist to this day lays blame on the land itself for continuing this maturing mystery. The piezoelectric effect, as it's known, is the ability of certain minerals to generate an electrical charge in response to applied stress. Some theorize that the quartz crystals that can be found beneath the surface of the Earth are discharging sparks of light when squeezed or pressed together. Gurdon, as well as the region where the light is said to dwell, is set on the outskirts of the New Madrid fault line. According to this theory, seismic activity puts pressure on the underground crystals, causing them to produce sparks of electrical discharge. However, this theory neglects to take into account eyewitness reports. Those who witness the light often observe it for an extended period of time, not for just brief moments. They witness it moving about the track or the woods, seemingly by its own volition. Sparks may appear, but they would only last for a moment's breath. The Gurdon Light remains an undying glow. With a lack of theories to provide a suitable and scientific explanation on the light's origins, are we reserved to believe that the phantom glow could be none other than the slain spirit of William McLean? Some knowledgeable locals have made claims that the light predates even the murder, dating all the way back to when the First Nations people ruled the land. Could it be that the Gurdon Light has always been there, gently roaming the woodlands for reasons only known to it? Whatever might be the reason, we at least are aware of its existence. The pursuit of its origins, however, continues to remain as a mystery. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for listening to this episode of the Gurdon Light on the Moonlight Lore podcast. I'm not entirely sure what the Gurdon Light could be, nor could I possibly speak for its authenticity since I don't live anywhere near Arkansas or know anyone personally who could attest to the truth of the whole situation, but according to the tales, the light is there. It's often seen and watched by many locals and visitors who come to discover it, so whatever it is, it apparently does exist. That said, no theory I presented today really speaks to me either. I'm a skeptical person through and through, and the prevailing theories that are suggested to be the cause of this mysterious glow just don't necessarily speak to me. Maybe if I could go there, explore, and study the environment a bit, I'd be able to give my opinion, but at the moment, It may be something supernatural or paranormal happening there. With that said, if any of my listeners do happen to live in Arkansas or have possibly ventured down the tracks to see the light yourselves, I'd love to hear about your experience to gain a better understanding of what might be going on here. If you do have any information, feel free to email me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com and we can talk a bit about it. In the meantime, while all of you wait for the next episode of the show, I ask that while I work to bring you more mysterious content, that you show your support by leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you might be listening on at this moment. It honestly only takes a second to do, not everyone does it, but it does help a lot. Another way you could show your support is by following the podcast on social media, recommending the show to your friends or family, or simply just continuing to listen. But the absolute best way to help support the show is by donating to the Patreon. I have 3 tiers up there, a $5 one, $10, and $25. Obviously, the $25 tier is going to get you more stuff, but any support at all would be greatly appreciated. I enjoy keeping the show advertisement free. I've gotten a few offers from some companies, but I turned them all down simply because I hate ads. But to make it up for not having ads, I do ask, if you're able, consider donating so I can keep the show as unique and ad-free as possible. Those of you who do donate get access to unheard bonus episodes the public doesn't get to hear. The most recent one being a demonic possession case occurring in Germany in, I think, 1840, but I can't quite remember. Also, just some quick news, another way to support the show is by checking out the new Etsy store I created last week. I've had a lot of people actually comment on the artwork I've done for the show, and I personally enjoy just creating the AI art and playing around with it in Photoshop because, let's be honest, AI art is far from being perfect. So I just figured that if some of you might like what I do on there, you could purchase a digital print of something I did. I believe the name of it is just the Moonlight Lore shop, I think. I honestly can't remember. And everything I have up there is only $10. For my listeners, though, I do like to lend my support where I can, so anyone who does happen to buy something, use the promo code MOONPOD50, all capital letters, to get 50% off whatever you buy. So if you want one picture, it will only be $5. If you wanted 5, you could get that down to a solid 25 or something like that. Also, for those of you who do support the podcast's Patreon, they will get the pictures completely for free as a way of saying thanks for your continued support. So if you even do like the lowest tier on the Patreon, it's like $5. You get all those prints for completely free. Honestly, I'm just happy people enjoy them. So yeah, once you buy them, you get a digital download, so you can print them off, you can frame them, you can hang them on a wall, put them on a coffee mug, or do whatever you want with them. I don't care. They're yours. And I'm just glad you enjoy them. Aside from that news, I don't believe there is anything else I need to mention at the moment. So until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful next couple of weeks. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.